Okay, Alec, thank you for coming onto the podcast. Great to finally get to chat to you.
Hey, Killian, thanks for having me. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on. As I've said to you already, like you've been following you on Instagram for a while. I think I probably first encountered your stuff with the memes and all that good stuff in the movement optimism space. Um, I guess first off, one thing I'd like to get to know is how did you actually get started with training to begin with?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, I grew up playing sports, um, baseball, tennis, track and field, just kind of dabbled in a little bit of everything. Was never terribly great at any of those things. I don't think I was terribly bad at any of them either, but I never really found that thing that I'm like, oh, this is my sport. This is the thing I have a gift for. So I just continued to enjoy like doing every sport I could just to hang out with my friends and have fun and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and then that was until I discovered something called Spartan Race, which is an obstacle course race. And from my track and field background, but also like lifting weights with football team and that kind of stuff, I found that I was actually really quite good at that. I had pretty good speed from track and field, cross country. Just wasn't quite fast enough to like be one of the best runners in the team. But I also had a lot of strength from, believe it or not, most people don't believe me looking at me now, but I played like defensive line for
Oh,
football
really?
up to early high school before I'm gonna get killed out here kind of thing. But I made up for it with like my strength and agility.
Hmm.
So kind of putting all that together when I got out into kind of a true hybrid competition, if you will, where you have to be fast, you have to have endurance, but you also have to have some overall athleticism and strength. Be able to pick up a sandbag, climb over a wall, that kind of thing. I was really great at it. And I was 16 years old when I did my first one, made it onto the podium. And it was also the most fun I'd ever had in my life. So
Yeah.
I started kind of pursuing more and more of those. And that's kind of how I fell into the hybrid space. So I was like, great, I can pursue running and strength and all this kind of stuff concurrently to be good at obstacle course racing. And up to that point, I had never really heard of any sport out there that it was doing that. And I had a great time with it. I got into CrossFit a little bit, but was always running and stuff on top of that as well. And now that's got to be, it's been about 15 years now since I did my first Spartan race. I ran on their professional team for a handful of years. But I've dabbled in lots of other sports and done a variety of things since then. But that was kind of my intro to hybrid training and hybrid competition.
Yeah. The first time that I kind of got exposed to anything that was in any way hybrid probably would have been CrossFit myself. That was one of the things I started off with when I was around sort of 15. And I think it was I don't know what your perspective is on CrossFit now, but even though I felt like there were things that certainly could have been done better on the programming side, it was cool how much they broke what seemed like the rules in strength and conditioning at the time for, seemingly what you're supposed to be able to do in terms of strength and endurance training. Did you find that as well?
Absolutely. And CrossFit certainly evolved over the years. And it could also be like the sources and coaches and athletes I'm exposed to, but it certainly seemed a little bit more haphazard when I was first exposed to it, of just like throwing random stuff together and hope like seeing what stuck. And it seems like now people are taking a little bit more of a methodical approach to it, which is cool. But it was also great just to get into a gym and be exposed to something like that. I think I went to a CrossFit gym for my first time at age like 16 or something like that, and just see people doing all sorts of crazy stuff, Olympic lifting, doing bicep curls in the corner, doing 500-meter sprints in the erg, just like all sorts of fitness in one space.
Yeah.
So it's a really cool way just to get exposed to a lot of different things and see like what are some of the things I'm good at, what are some of the things that I'm bad at, and get absolutely humbled and wrecked by like certain metcons. The CrossFit coach would be like, "Hey, I bet you'd be good at this one," and then I try it and I'm not because I like my deadlift is terrible. I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, I got to work on that. So I think it was a really good environment just for not necessarily feeling bad about myself, but realizing like there's so many things to work on.
Right, right. And speaking of CrossFit, actually, I saw that you broke the Murph record at one point. Is that right? I'm assuming that's a big piece of that
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well.
It's funny. It kind of, it's come full circle because that was one of the first workouts that I had done out of a CrossFit gym. I remember Diane, Cindy, and then Murph were like some of the first workouts that I ever did. Um, and I remember I loved that workout from the first time I did it. Cindy, especially, which for those who don't know, Cindy is just kind of the body weight exercise portion of Murph. It's 20 minutes of push ups, pull ups, and squats. And I loved that workout so much when I first founded it, like when I was 16 years old, that I started making that something I did every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, which in hindsight is not the best training approach. But I loved it. And I would just like rip push ups, pull ups, and squats in my basement, like, for 20, 30, 40 minutes straight all the time on top of running. So I have a huge background kind of doing that workout or versions of that workout. So it was pretty cool, 10, 15 years later, to be able to do that workout, competitively and set a world best time for it.
Yeah. And what was your time, just out of curiosity?
So my time's 32:41, and that's for the unpartitioned format. So, doing the 1 mile run in the 20-pound weight vest, then the 100 pull-ups, knock out all the pull-ups before, 200 push-ups, get all those done before 300 squats, and then another mile run.
Oh my God, man. That is like remembering what that workout was like for me and how long it took. That is pretty sick. So hats off to you. And I never even tried the one with the weight vest on it. I don't think I would have heard of that.
Yeah, in some ways, people are like, "Oh, unpartitioned, that sounds brutal." To me, it takes longer, certainly, but to me, it's not as intensely painful as partitioned.
Right.
Because when I do that workout partitioned, it's just like there's no rest, there's no stopping. It's just like insanely fast paced. I feel like I'm gonna throw up the whole time.
Yeah.
That usually takes like 21, 22 minutes or so with the weight vest, but broken up. So it's kind of nice to space it out across like 32, do some push-ups, catch your breath a second, do some push-ups. Then it becomes more than just that like kind of muscular endurance, fatigue resistance test.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay. So yeah, you were saying that, you kind of found yourself in the hybrid space then eventually. And then how did you find yourself moving into then coaching as a profession?
Yeah, so I went to college originally for physics. I wanted to be a scientist. That's kind of what my passion was growing up, just kind of the math and science nerd.
Right.
Um, but I think that anytime you reach a high level in sport or really anything, people start coming to you for advice. So I'd gotten pretty good in the obstacle racing world, and people started saying like, asking for advice in that sport, especially because it was a relatively new sport.
Hmm.
It's not like bodybuilding where you just Google like what's a bodybuilding program or pull something out of a magazine. The sport of obstacle racing was brand new. There were very few people doing it. So I was getting a lot of questions of like how you balance, the run training with like, preparing for some of the obstacles and that kind of stuff. And, I was just kind of figuring it out for myself as well. But, I had a couple years head start on some people that were just getting into the sport. So really just starting to mentor, friends and that kind of thing. Um, and eventually had like a very small roster of clients. And then I was very fortunate to have a coaching company started by Alex Viata. He reached out and he's like, "Hey, we see obstacle racing becoming a big thing. We noticed what you're doing in the sport. I've been writing articles, writing about training, coaching a few people." He's like, "Would you be willing to come on our staff and work with obstacle race athletes specifically?" So that's kind of how I got my first official coaching gig. And really, that just started expanding into other hybrid disciplines, starting to see a lot of overlap between obstacle course athletes and like military athletes, combat athletes, tactical athletes. So started working with a lot of them as well. Started training people for special forces selection, that sort of stuff. Working with first responders, police, fire, all that kind of stuff. A lot of overlap with obstacle course athletes, and then that really expanded into even working with some more specialized athletes, like just straight up runners, or people that wanted to train for a powerlifting meet without, completely abandoning their cardiovascular health, that kind of
Right.
stuff. So the longer I've been coaching, the more broad my roster has gotten. But it kind of started with obstacle course athletes, and then military, and then just kind of exploded out from there.
Right, right. And yeah, certainly you can see how people in the military would need that combination of strength and endurance and firefighters. And really, there's not too many sports where people would make the argument against having some cardiovascular fitness, except for powerlifting, maybe.
Yep.
Uh, but so okay, I assume you've been doing that for quite a while. So is there any particular mistakes or problems that you see crop up with the people try to go about programming for strength and endurance when they do it themselves?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest problem, especially with, I'd say, kind of younger, uh, more time rich, like they're just motivated, they're hungry, they want to be good at all the things. I see a lot of those athletes, they just start doing all of the training. They're like, I'll just train for 4 hours a day. I'll just run all the miles. I'll lift all the weights. I'll do a marathon program and a powerlifting program and throw in some extra buys and tries and just like start doing all the stuff. And one of two things happens. One, it's just they either get hurt or burn out or whatever. Or two, it actually works.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the more dangerous part is when I think you are pretty young and hungry and have some good lifestyle factors on your side. You can make that work for a while as a beginner, but it's unsustainable to just take the brute force approach long term. You're going to start to develop certain weak spots that need a little bit more attention as you need even more, volume to continue to adapt. You're going to start running out of space and energy in your program, and then you're going to get frustrated, and it's going to be like, I already feel like I'm training 30 hours a week, and now I'm not making any progress. Where do I go from here? So I definitely encourage people to take a much more methodical, I don't want to say minimalistic approach, but very efficient approach, because you want to leave that time and energy available in your program to keep adding things as you need them. You don't want to reach the end of the runway, just by throwing in everything into a program in year one and then not know where to go from there. So really be efficient with your program. Don't just put stuff in just to see what sticks. Like really take a methodical approach to figuring out what are my weak spots, what are the things that I really need in a program, and then work from there. Because especially as a beginner, you probably don't need as much total training volume as you think. And I always hate seeing hybrid athletes in their first year or two putting in these like crazy weeks. I'm like, a lot of that time and energy is just going into recovery. What are you leaving left over for the adaptation? So yeah, be as efficient as possible. Don't throw too much at yourself. That's my probably the biggest mistake that I see.
Right, right. And I haven't done a huge amount of work with people who are combining strength and endurance, but with the ones that I have, I've always been amazed at how much progress people can make on the running side of things with very minimal frequency. Like a guy that I was working with recently and still am has been able to get up to like 8 kilometers or more just running once per week. I had another client who did a half marathon just running twice per week and got a fairly respectable time. And I think a lot of people think that you need to be doing like 3 to 5 running sessions a week to get those kind of results.
Yeah, for sure. And even more than just the frequency, I think just, total weekly volume, it's amazing what you can do with like an hour a week. If you do that as one hour session or 3 20-minute sessions, 1 hour a week does not sound like a lot, but it's infinitely more than zero, which is what
Right. Yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of strength athletes are doing. And I think people are often really quick to look at, even like if you just Google like beginner 5K program or couch to 5K program, those are pretty conservative programs, but that might even be too aggressive for like a first time hybrid athlete who's already juggling a lot of other stressors. They're probably significantly heavier, than just like your average
Right.
person with all the muscle mass. So, you're when you're starting out, you probably need to be a lot more conservative than you think, and just make sure it's sustainable. Because again, like you said, 1 hour a week, basically, you can make progress for a long time.
Mm. Yeah, and I don't know if this is something you found as well, but I know for myself when I started running, I was kind of on the chunkier end of having done a bulk. I was up at like 95 kilos nearly. And I found for myself and with people who've been in the kind of like 85 to 90 kilo range, guys who've maybe been strength training for a few years, the first few weeks seem to be really about actually adapting to the impact that's going through
Yeah.
your ankles, your shins, and everything. I didn't really find that running was taxing my gas tank too much until I could sort of consistently go out and run for about 20 minutes at a time without having to stop because of getting sore ankles, sore shins. Is that something you see a lot?
Absolutely. I would say for, the first couple of months, sometimes longer, people are going to be much more limited by structure than by energy systems. Um, I think that you can ramp up total aerobic hours just in terms of pure time faster than you might think, but it's the structure that takes a little bit of time to catch up. So If you are kind of itching to be as fit as possible, as quickly as possible, I like to utilize a range of modalities, like get on the bike, do something that's lower impact, get in the pool, something like that. Because if you want to, if you're like committed to, I want to be the best hybrid athlete, I want to be super well conditioned. Even if you do want to, long term run a half marathon, you can't or shouldn't just go out and run 10 miles on your first day, even if you're, tough enough. I find a lot of experienced athletes who've been in the gym for 5, 10 years. They like have that grit. They can push through anything. So you tell them to go run 10 miles, they'll probably survive it. But just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Right.
Take an athlete like that, just have them run, 1 mile at a time, or 1 or 2K at a time, and give that structure time to adapt. But in the meantime, you can say, hey, go get in the pool, swim for 30, 45 minutes. They're probably going to be just fine with that. And they can probably do more, duration per week than you might expect, just from an energy system perspective. Your heart, your lungs are incredible when it comes to their ability to adapt and adapt fairly quickly. But bone, tendon, that kind of stuff, it takes time.
Absolutely. And Alec, if you had somebody who's like, reasonably strong, has built up a little bit of cardiovascular fitness, and let's say they have like, strength goals and endurance goals, would you usually take the approach of chasing one of those first and kind of having it as the main focus and having the other thing just there in the background, kind of taking like a block focused approach? Or does it sort of depend on how challenging the goal is? Can you sometimes chase the endurance and the strength at the same time?
I think that the great thing about being a beginner is it doesn't take a super large dose of a stimulus to improve. And
Sure.
so the more of a beginner you are, I think the more kind of rabbits you can chase. Because essentially, like, the rabbits are slower. You can chase more at a time, but the more experience you get, the faster those rabbits get, the more you might want to just focus on one at a time. And some people may be offended to to hear this, but I think that most people are not as experienced as they think they are.
Right.
A lot of people want to train like advanced athletes. They consider themselves advanced athletes, just for maybe the length of time they've been doing something. But there's lots of people who have been training for 10 years that are still beginners or intermediate. Just because you've been training for 10 years does not make you an advanced athlete. You might have just been training at kind of a beginner to intermediate level for a long time. And if you're kind of a recreational athlete, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with, but if you're hitting the gym a couple times a week, I don't care how long you've been doing it, I probably wouldn't consider you extremely advanced. So with that in mind, if you're going to take a hybrid training program, I would say most people, 99% of people listening to this podcast can probably pursue strength and endurance concurrently for a really long time before they start having to really take that like periodization approach or start prioritizing one while one's in maintenance. Eventually, you may reach that point, but I think it's further down the line than most people think. And I see a lot of beginners who are like wanting to put together these very periodized plans, but I just don't think it's necessary for most people, especially when they're starting out.
Right. Absolutely. And I actually found that for myself. I was amazed. Like the best squat that I ever hit was a 200 kilo squat. And I never thought that I would have been able to do 2 days of running while I was building up to that. And I think there's maybe I'm wrong. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this, but I still feel like the cardio kills gains thing is fairly prevalent. Maybe not so much in the space that we operate in, kind of like the more kind of evidence-based bubble on Instagram and social media. But would you feel like that's still kind of the prevailing paradigm that people have in lifting culture?
In the circles that I spend time in, it's certainly less
Really?
prevailing than it used to be. Um, I think in the general public, maybe a little bit less so. In recent years, I've come across more people who they're not even extremely into fitness, but they talk to me, they ask me what I do, and they're like, oh, that reminds me of Nick Bare, for example. And I'm like, oh, there's actually just kind of, regular people out in the world that are familiar with some of these hybrid athletes now and kind of seeing what can be done. So I think that's super cool that, the hybrid training, trend, if you can call it that, has reached that level of the population. It's not as, niche as it used to be, which is really cool. Um, I think that sometimes people take it too far, and I kind of like to, argue for the other side a little bit when it comes to like cardio kills your gains. because I think all training interferes with training on some level. Like
Right.
stress is stress. Um, it's like you could argue that hypertrophy interferes with strength to some level, and you could also argue that hypertrophy supports strength. But if you're going in and doing a bodybuilding program, that's probably not the best thing for maximizing your 1 rep max strength. There's going to be some fatigue there, right? So they can support each other, but the fatigue can also be an interfering trait as well. So not obviously the exact same thing, but there's some overlap there with cardio in that it can potentiate recovery, it can improve your work capacity, it can actually support gains in some ways. You could make an argument for that. And obviously, training stress is stress. It's going to be a negative for recovery in some ways. So I don't think it's black and white. I don't think we should just say like, oh, it doesn't kill your gains. Like, forget about that. It depends on the individual. It depends on the volume being done. It depends if we're talking short term or long term. And I think especially short term, I think we should be willing to accept that it may kill your gains a little bit at the beginning, and you kind of have to get over that hump. Um, I've talked to so many people who they like tried cardio because they had seen the hybrid training trend. They give it a shot for like 3 weeks and they feel terrible and they give up.
Hmm.
So I think we should have the expectation. It's like, yeah, when you start running, if you decide to start running, you're probably going to feel like shit for a couple of weeks. It is going to kill your gains for a couple of weeks. And you just got to keep going, give the body time to adapt, like give it 12 weeks before you make any rash decisions, be conservative. But I think kind of setting that expectation from the start is probably a good thing, and it'll actually create more buy-in in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, the thing with beginners is that they can get good at lots of stuff at the same time. And then the mark of someone who's getting more advanced is that they kind of have to pick and choose what's going to make up the training stress in their week. And you can only balance that to, such a degree. Um, so the other thing that I wanted to ask you about then was, we're both kind of in like this movement optimism space, I guess might be one way of describing it. It was something that I personally stumbled upon, I think through a Greg Lehman YouTube video, just completely on accident. Something got recommended to me with my YouTube algorithm maybe like 5 years ago or so. And it was definitely a huge paradigm shift for me in my coaching and my own training and how I kind of understand injury and loading and all that sort of stuff. Um, I'm always interested to find out from other coaches who are now kind of in this space how that happened for you.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and you had kind of posed this to me ahead of time, and I was thinking about it, and I was like racking my brain, like trying to think, like when did I first come across some of this idea, and I think it was so subtle and gradual. I don't think there was like this singular influence or aha moment or anything like that that I can point to. But I do think there's been a definite shift in like my language, my content, some of my beliefs. I was scrolling through like some posts I'd made in the past, and I could see like how the narrative that I was pushing essentially did gradually shift over time. My posts 10 years ago versus 5 years ago versus today,
Yeah.
there's definitely been a shift there. And I was thinking about some of the different directions that my coaching and my training and my content potentially could have gone had my influences been different. um, and I was kind of thinking about how this idea of like movement optimism versus a lot of what you see from like what we kind of joke is like the functional boys, like
Yeah.
um that kind of training. It seems like very very opposite, kind of at first glance. But I started to realize that like the further you take those extremes from kind of the center of like how most people train, when you start going in a more like extreme direction in terms of movement optimism versus like going towards like functional patterns and David Wack, like very
Mhm.
much the other direction. I find that like extremes of those have a decent amount in common. Actually, it's the narrative kind of behind what you're doing that changes a little bit. Because I can certainly see some of the training that I was doing in the past and some of the coaching I was doing in the past, like 10 years ago, was kind of going in that direction of like maybe being pulled into like the functional pattern side of the
Mhm.
the algorithm and that kind of thing. And I found myself doing a lot of like single leg squats and stuff with cables and bands pulling me in different directions, and a lot of like rotational stuff. um And I do some of the same stuff now. It's just the reason I do it is completely different.
Yeah.
The load that I use is completely different. Kind of the explanation is completely different. But I think that sometimes there's actually more in common than we like to admit in terms of doing things that are a bit more unusual. I look back and I saw I was doing this exercise that most people would say is going to like tear your ACL or something like that. This was like 10 years ago. And I didn't know what movement optimism was 10 years ago, but I knew what like the lateral sling was from like anatomy trains,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so that may have been my rationale for doing it at that point. And now it's like, it's a great adductor exercise, and like your knee's gonna adapt, it's gonna be fine. Um, but I think that the exercises that I've done, deciding to push things hard, I think a lot of that has actually been remarkably consistent across my training and in my athletic career. Um, but I think that I'm fortunate to have basically trained hard the whole time. I think the inner like bro in me has made me want to always load stuff up and go as hard as I can at a variety of things. And I think there's definitely a danger with the narrative that a lot of kind of functional trainers bring to the space of like being so worried about technique and injury and perfection, kind of technical absolutism, that the load and the effort behind it isn't there. And there's this kind of fear there as well of what happens if you don't meet their standards. Um, but to be fair, I think there's some really cool exercises. Like I love the emphasis that, some trainers I really dislike their narrative, they do some cool exercises, and I love how much they emphasize like rotation, for example. Um, so yeah, I think they have a lot in common, but there's definitely been this shift over like the last decade from kind of one extreme to the other, despite that kind of consistency in some of my exercise selection.
Yeah. And I would say that it's similar for myself. Even though I only came across the movement optimism stuff a few years ago, there was never a time in my training or in my coaching where I feel like I demonize stuff as much as some people really entrenched in that kind of functional fitness idea can't might be. But I think what you touched on there, which is the narratives around why we do things, and why we don't do certain things is really important. And I feel like a lot of the movement optimism versus functional or kinesiophobic, whatever way you want to frame it, it really comes down to maybe perspective on pain and injury. And I think maybe we need to become more accepting of the fact that we don't know the answer to why people get hurt all the time. We're obviously not 100% capable of predicting when injuries are going to happen. What I've found personally with the movement optimism paradigm placed on top of what I do now is that it certainly is very liberating and seems to line up a little bit closer with the kind of chaotic reality of injury and pain, more so than the very kind of restrictive rules that I would have used to have in my head about keeping a neutral spine all the time and not letting your knees cave in. Have you found that to be the same? That it sort of like opens up more options?
Yeah, I think that it's great because it allows you to embrace the kind of natural variation, across different individuals. Whereas before, I'd say, 10 years ago, if I was training clients in person, I may be looking for someone to move a very, very specific way. Um, Getting them to squat a certain way, often getting them to try to squat exactly like me, for example. So I think one of the biggest differences is now when I look at how someone's moving, I'm not trying to think about what's right and wrong. I'm thinking more about giving them more options, more movement
Mhm.
variability. If you're squatting or deadlifting or doing whatever a particular way, I'm not too concerned about are you doing it the right way. I'm more concerned about can you do it this way and that.
Yeah.
Can you deadlift and what can you round your back and can you arch your back? Can you do both of those things? So when I see someone who comes in and they're like cat backing their deadlifts and good morning, doing their squats like a good morning, and they just have this very like low back, posterior chain dominant movement strategy for everything. I'm like, that's fine. You can do those exercises that way, but what can we do to get some more, knee flexion dominant strategies? What can
Yeah.
we do for your quads? So I think it's very liberating. Um, I think that a lot of people kind of straw man movement optimism and say like, oh, you think nothing matters or technique doesn't matter, or you have no reason to like coach or cue or correct those sorts of things. But I think it's quite the opposite. I think it still gives you a lot of information about how you should coach someone, what strategies you might want to coach someone into in certain contexts. It's just a much more, kind of empowering way to do so. And it's a more approach oriented way to do so, where it's like, hey, I want you to do this so you can experience all these benefits, not, hey, stop doing this because of all these dangers or threats. And I think that's a really important shift in that it makes people a lot more confident. It makes them more excited to train. It makes them more excited and kind of empowered to train on their own as well, which at least in the personal training space is a huge problem I've run into, where a lot of people, because of the narratives they've gotten from coaches and trainers over time, they're hesitant to go there by themselves because they're like, I'm worried about doing this without supervision because what if I do it wrong and that sort of thing. And, we don't have a, uh, you know, kyphosis epidemic or a knee valgus epidemic. We have an obesity and metabolic health epidemic. So if I'm just going to prioritize one thing or describe like what is my job as a trainer, it's to get people healthier, improve their metabolic health, kind of improving their movement quality and that kind of stuff is all secondary to that. If I'm not getting someone to train consistently, train hard and drive some of those metabolic improvements, then I'm just not doing my job, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah. Um, and to go back to what you were saying there about, with the movement optimism stuff, I think maybe one way this way of thinking about things might evolve is that I think about really in terms of what society thinks about athleticism as kind of a broad concept. Um, and I think it's kind of what a lot of the functional training stuff is trying to get towards, this idea of being functional. It's kind of like roughly meant to be synonymous with athleticism. For me, athleticism is the ability to adapt as kind of easily as possible to like the physical environment around you. And part of that means that while being able to put a stick over your head and squat down deep in an overhead squat position, I don't think that that is an indicator for whether or not you're going to get back pain or knee pain in your life. Um, there can be an argument made that it would be good to have the option to be able to do that because it does say a certain amount about things like your shoulder mobility and your hip mobility. And that would maybe be one way I could see the kind of two seemingly divergent philosophies end up kind of meeting somewhere in the middle, that like it's just about getting the narrative around why this stuff is important, right, as opposed to saying that nothing matters and you can just be limited to a few small movement options for everything.
Exactly. And I think that the issue with kind of the functional side is they have such specific kind of goalposts of you
Right.
have to be able to do these kind of arbitrary movement tests and that kind of thing. Whereas the movement optimist approach is like all these options are good. There's like a lot of directions that we can potentially take your training. And you don't have to have all the options. You don't have to be able to do all the things. You don't have to be able to pass the ankle dorsiflexion test and the shoulder mobility test. And like, you don't have to check every single box.
Mhm.
We just want to like give you plenty of options, but it's not about the specific ones necessarily.
Right.
Um, and I also think that, the more specialized of an athlete you are, if you look at someone who is a high performer in a specific sport, it's probably because they have, unique anatomical traits and whatnot that makes them very good at that specific task. And acknowledging that that's probably going to make them not so good at some of the other tasks.
Yeah.
And that type of variation is okay too. Where I think on the functional side, there's this kind of very black and white of like everyone needs to do this and like
Mhm.
everyone has to pass the FMS and that kind of thing, where we often see the opposite with like, college athletes. Often we have data that suggests that college athletes that did better on the FMS were more likely to get injured and vice versa.
Mhm.
Um, why exactly is that the case? I think is, it's complicated. But the idea that just being able to meet these arbitrary standards is always going to inoculate you against injury or always going to make you a better athlete is just not the case.
Yeah, 100%. And something you were saying a few minutes ago there, about how you kind of see that your primary objective is to get people moving, meeting physical activity standards. It reminds me of a post that you put up a while ago, actually, about that you had kind of taken issue with that whole quality versus quantity um, idea that gets said a lot. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a very, very important kind of central message to me. If I had to sum up, some of my coaching philosophy in just a one or two posts, that would certainly be one of them. Um, it kind of goes along with this kind of like functional approach to training where people say like move well and then move often of
Mhm.
like, just use the empty bar, the PVC pipe and get your technique dialed in and then load it up. And it all sounds very reasonable.
Yeah.
It sounds like well-intended advice and I'm sure that it is. Um, but you don't get good at things by like trying to do the thing one time perfectly. Like
Mhm.
if you're a new painter, you don't just try to perfect one painting and spend thousands of hours on one painting. You have to paint a bunch of really shitty paintings.
Mhm.
For a long time, you're probably going to suck at it for a long time as well. And that's certainly the case with movement, any sort of skill acquisition. If you want to get good at squatting, you're not going to just figure out how to squat perfectly before you make it challenging. You're going to have challenging squats that look terrible, and your technique's probably going to look a little bit ugly. You might get some looks in the gym of like, I don't know if that guy knows what he's doing, but it's okay. Like that is the process of getting better at it. And if you obsess over like your first rep, or you obsess over squatting the empty bar perfectly before adding load, you're really setting yourself up for a very, very slow and frustrating journey. Um, so I like to just kind of flip that on its head and say focus on the quantity and the effort before working on quality or making things perfect. You can always use, various constraints and supporting exercises, accessories, whatever you want to call it, to work on weak spots and kind of give yourself more movement options over time. But it should never be at the expense of hard work. Um, I don't think anyone's movement is so dysfunctional or so wrong, or anyone's mobility so limited that they shouldn't be working hard when they go to the gym. And I see far too many people, especially people paying for professional help. They'll
Mhm.
pay $100 an hour to go to the gym and lay on a table. And it's like, that's not how we should be spending
Right.
people's time.
Yeah.
Um, and especially people that are very time limited. If you only have an hour or two per week to work out, you're the last person that should be going to the gym and laying on a table. If you're a professional athlete, if you have 4 hours a day to train, then sure, like fill up some of your day with some cupping or stretching or whatever. I don't care.
Yeah.
You have the kind of time to work with that. But if you're like most people and you're going to the gym once or twice a week, you need to be working. I don't want to say as hard as you can, but you need to be extremely efficient with your time. So if what you're doing is not high output, metabolically demanding, high mechanical tension, you're really missing an important opportunity there.
Absolutely. And, it relates to a disagreement I've had with a lot of some of the exercises that I see, promoted online on social media, um, or even ones that I just see people doing in the gym. Um, I would say they're inefficient, like not all exercises are created equal, I think, in terms of um the bang for your buck that you're going to get. And I think sometimes people forget that you get this response of like, oh, well, what's the harm, what's the harm of just including this thing and just including that thing. But I think sometimes people forget that, like, if you've only got 2 or 3 hours a week to train, you can't just keep piling exercise after exercise in just for the fun of it, just to give it a go. Because if you're doing 12 exercises in a training session, how difficult are any of those really going to be? How are you going to progress those over months? Have you seen that as well?
You know what I have seen, and this used to be shocking to me, and I think this is one way that my coaching and like outlook on training has changed because in the past, like maybe 10 years ago, I had heard of athletes who were, better athletes than I was, exceptionally strong. And
Mhm.
they would tell me about their training and often how little they trained. I talked to someone who's like way stronger than me, and they're like, yeah, I go to the gym 3 times a week. And my mind's like blown. I'm like, how is this possible? Like thinking about through all the things that I do and the amount of time I spend in the gym. I'm like, there's no way that this person works out, half as much as I do, and they're getting these results. And I've come across lots and lots of people who take a very, time efficient approach to training who are in tremendous shape.
Mhm.
Um, and I think to like some of my, personal training clients, stuff like that, who they may train a couple hours a week as well, and they're not getting nearly the results. But I think there's a difference in the when you've been, a high level athlete and you've learned what it's like to push yourself, you know how to pick the very best exercises for you, you know how to give that effort,
Mhm.
prioritize recovery, prioritize lifestyle, you have everything in order, you'll find that it doesn't actually take that much training to at least be, fairly impressive. Maybe not to be the best in the world, but I think most people could train 3 or 4 hours a week total and be pretty darn fit. But you're not going to do that if you're spending 20 minutes of each session rolling around on a foam roller and another 20 minutes of each session doing some like band pull aparts and
Yeah.
external rotations. Like if you want to be extremely fit on 3 to 4 hours a week, it's got to be pretty tough. Um, so I think when we see a lot of these, low to moderate, stimulus exercises promoted on social media because they look cool and fancy and whatever. Um, yeah, like what's the harm? Maybe it's not going to hurt, but for 99% of people who are not training a shit ton, for most people who have a normal training schedule, there's definitely something better. There's definitely a way to get fitter with the time that they have. And unfortunately, most of that stuff just doesn't look sexy. Some of the fittest people I know that train like 3 hours a week, I'm like, well, how are you that jacked on 3 hours a week? And they'll be like, I deadlift, I do bike sprints. It's just like a couple like unsexy but very challenging things.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that just doesn't sell well. It doesn't make very good content.
Yeah. And on that, we see that typically the stuff that does really well on social media tends to be the sexier looking stuff, the kind of stuff Joe Seedman puts up, for example. Um, what is your perspective on where do you think the fitness industry is at the moment in terms of, do you think that it has improved with the advent of social media? Is it getting worse? And do you think there's something that could be done to improve it if it has?
Yeah, this is a tough question. It's sometimes so hard to break out of your little bubble, right?
Right.
And I've been trying to do that. Actually, I have another podcast next week where we're like intentionally diving into some like content we don't like.
Mm.
And so I've been forced to like start looking for stuff of like what are some of the other people out in the world saying. So I've been like on my explore and reels page more like trying to look for like what's popular right now, right? And every time I think things are getting better, I go on like the reels and then I see some of the stuff that's getting like, a million plus views.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that's kind of disappointing. Um, I think that like most things, like politics, et cetera, I think things tend to get increasingly polarized, at times.
Yeah.
And I think we see that with fitness, especially. We continue to have this like war between, movement optimists and functional people and people who don't understand anything other than pure bodybuilding and just like all these different camps. I think people get drawn into. I do think, I've seen more and more great information on social media, in large part due to the ability to make money on it,
Yeah.
which people often talk about that as a bad thing. But I think there's very knowledgeable, brilliant, physical therapists, for example, who, now not only are they able to make money servicing clients in person, but they can, make educational courses and make content and that kind of stuff. So there's incentive for people who know their stuff to share it with the world. Um, Whereas there wasn't before. So I think it's just a matter of looking in the right places, following the right people.
Yeah.
Um, and that can be tricky to know how to do it or at least get started. I think once you get your foot in the door, you start to realize like, oh, I can seek out good information and you know how to sort good information from the bad, you know, some of the red flags to look for of like,
Mhm.
oh, this person seems kind of shady for this reason or that reason, or oh, they say not to trust, you know, whoever, but they're making 15% selling Redmond sea salt. Like it's kind of weird. Um, you start to look for some of that kind of stuff, and you can
Yeah.
sort out some of the good sources from the bad, right? And then I think it'd be like, oh, there's actually some really really good stuff here. I just have to look in the right place. Where I think that we can potentially do better is I think I kind of get frustrated sometimes when I see like really smart, good creators sharing like educational content and then like whining about the algorithm and how like no one wants to engage with high quality content or like,
Right.
oh, my good post only got 3 likes. Like it's your fault. Like I hate to say it, but like you are in control of getting that information out there. If it's not reaching people, it's because it's not good. Not that it's not intelligent or valuable, but it's up to you to make things entertaining. It's up
Mhm.
to you to like engage with an audience. Like we have an ability to get ourselves out there. I know I'm not the biggest page in the world, but I feel like I tend to bring a pretty nuanced approach. I make a lot of 10 slide, you know, tiny text posts, and I manage to get that out to people because I often do use some like slightly clickbaity headlines, or I
Yeah.
know what's going to look good on the explore page, what's going to make people click on the first page and then slide over. And it's actually a wall of text talking about movement optimism, but
Yeah.
it's a way to suck people in. And I think
Sure.
we have to take some responsibility for that. Yeah, I just kind of get frustrated with like good creators trying for like a few months and like, God, no one wants good content. People want good content. You just have to put a little bit more effort into getting some mass appeal. And I think that can certainly be done. I don't think they're opposites. People like to talk about like stuff that goes viral versus stuff that's actually good. I don't think, you know, I think that's a false dichotomy. I think you can make stuff that has that viral mass appeal and is good quality information. Um, I had a running post talking about if running kills your gains or not, talking about some of the things, you know, to watch out for, common
Mm.
mistakes when combining running with lifting. And I just had a catchy tune. I was running on the treadmill without a shirt on. It got like 20 million views or whatever. But it was quality information. It wasn't
Yeah.
like, you know, a bunch of BS. Um, and I think we just have to try harder to get the information out there and be willing to like chase some of the numbers. I think there's nothing wrong with trying to have 100,000 followers or a million followers. If we actually want to change the world and change the fitness industry, we need more good creators in that space too. I think the great creators with 5,000, 10,000 followers are great. We need more of those. But we
Mhm.
also need more people stepping up and saying, I'll make a viral video, I'll do a clickbait headline
Yeah.
to get the information I want out there. So I'd love to see more of that and less whining about the algorithm.
Absolutely. I think people need to realize that you have to meet the general public where they're at a little bit, and there's a happy medium somewhere between, you know, selling a magic red drink to people to burn fat and gain muscle, and putting up, sometimes I see people put up Instagram posts that have good information in them, but they may as well be lecture slides at a scientific conference. And you
Right.
have to remember that, like, I think the average attention span on a platform like Instagram has got to be somewhere around 10 seconds at most,
Yeah.
maybe in the push. So if you think you're going to get people to, like, you know, slide through 5 text-heavy posts with no kind of hook whatsoever, especially if they don't know who you are, it just seems very naive. And then, of course, you can sit back and just whine about, oh, the charlatans get all the views, but you can't deny that these people are good at marketing themselves. Yes, their information is poor, their ethics are questionable, but they're doing something right. They're putting something, a piece of cheese in front of the audience that they want. And I think actually somebody who's done a great job of kind of getting the balance of that right is Mike Israetel. Um, that guy was putting out such great information for so long, and it was really very contained within a small audience of evidence-based coaches and trainers. And then he just started doing videos making fun of celebrity workouts, and
Yeah.
explaining why in evidence-based terms they're wrong. But people are clicking in because they see Chris Hemsworth's workout routine, and then here's this guy who's charismatic, cracking a few jokes, and saying like, "Hey, by the way, doing burpees and kicking a boxing bag probably isn't the best way to get shredded." Like,
It's great. And I think it can be even trickier for like general population fitness. Like Dr. Mike caters more to like hypertrophy and that kind of stuff. I
yeah,
think Jordan Syatt is an example of someone who does a great job at like having mass appeal for kind of general population, just talking about, fat loss and the importance of a calorie deficit for fat loss as opposed to like all the fads and that kind of stuff that are out there. So if you're listening and don't follow Jordan, I think he's a great example of someone who does social media
mhm.
really, really well in that like really tough niche. I guess it's not really a niche, but to have that mass appeal for general population fitness and do it well, I think is super tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, And so in your own training at the moment, like where would your current focus be? Do you have any kind of competitions that you're preparing for, or are you trying to get up to doing any kind of particular lift, like break a PR and something?
Yeah, so I'd say, I tend to take a somewhat seasonal approach. I'd say on average, I kind of split my training emphasis like 50-50 strength goals and endurance goals, but it
Hmm.
probably shifts to more like 60-40 in favor of endurance in the warmer months, maybe 60-40 in favor of strength in the colder months. And this summer in particular has been a really big push for endurance. I have a marathon in the Swiss Alps in a couple of weeks. So that's been the big focus. For most of the summer, we're trying to maintain my strength as best as I can. Set a few subtle PRs along the way, and then probably in the winter, I'll probably dial back the running a little bit and push the strength a little bit as well. But a couple goals that I've had in my head, I want to get a double body weight, single leg freestanding deadlift. I've done it in the landmine. I've done it on the Smith machine, trying to hit double body weight on the free bar for the single leg deadlift. I
Nice.
don't know why it's arbitrary. They're all arbitrary, right? But they're
Yeah.
just like nice round numbers. That's kind of the next one I've been thinking of. Um, Always been a big single leg deadlift fan. Um, I'm trying to work on a triple body weight high bar squat.
Hmm.
Um, it's actually a number of years ago. I've gotten it low bar, like powerlifting depth, but I want to get a nice like deep high bar triple body weight squat. So that's another thing kind of on the to-do list. Um, and then endurance wise, it's a good question. Endurance wise, there's been a lot of like hybrid challenges floating around, like the 500-pound squat with 5 minute mile. Um, Maybe coming up with some cool ones of those to start knocking out.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, to be honest, I've been at the hybrid thing a little while, and any small, 5 pound PR, 2 second PR on a run, I'll take it all. Like
Yeah.
just trying to squeak out little bits and pieces of gains here at this point. So give me another pound of muscle mass, take 5 seconds off my mile. Like any measurable progress for me at this point, and any of the things that I'll take it.
Yeah. Especially as we get into our 30s and it starts getting harder to recover and all that fun stuff.
Yeah. Yep.
And what is the kind of like breakdown of your training week? Do you have days where you're training twice per day? Are you training every day?
I train twice a day most days. Right now, it's not a true rest day, but Monday is my lightest day. I kind of start the week off with just like a pretty light upper body session, and that's it.
Mhm.
So it's a very like low stress day, hit some arms, that kind of thing. Kind of like having a routine of waking up and going to the gym. Go to the gym with my wife on Mondays. It's kind of a nice way to start the day. Usually training twice a day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Friday is my biggest leg day of the week. So it's kind of one of my longer sessions. Um, this summer, I've been doubling up, doing a lot of cardio on the weekend, like long cardio days, Saturday and Sunday. Um, Most of the time, I'd probably only do a big cardio day on one of those days. And then the other day could be a rest day or something like that. But the last like 12 to 16 weeks of marathon prep, I've been doubling down on some of the weekend trail runs and that kind of stuff. Um, but typically, most of those double days, I'm waking up, doing some cardio first thing in the morning, like 6 a.m. or whatever. get about an hour of cardio in, and I'll hit a lift in the afternoon on those days. And then Friday just being my biggest leg day, you just kind of set that off on its own. Go to the gym for like an hour and a half, 2 hours for that leg day.
That's not leaving a lot of time for binge watching Netflix, Alec.
No, it's not. I do my best though. Yeah, it'd be nice. That's kind of it's funny you say that because that's my goal. I don't think most people say like they want to watch more Netflix or play more video games. So like I wanna try to get my like work schedule consolidated a little bit and just have some more, free time to kill doing dumb stuff like that. So that's I guess even more than some of those fitness goals, more like business personal goals is be a little bit more time efficient and get some free time back this year.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely not something that the average person needs to be focusing on trying to get more teeth. But yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Okay, so kind of coming towards the end here, one thing that I usually like to ask any coaches that I have on, so I think it gives a really good insight into, like there's so much stuff that any good coach will agree on in terms of like the principles of training. And I feel like everybody is going to be doing 90% of the same kind of stuff. But I'm always interested to hear if there's anything that you feel like you've made a significant change in your mind on recently, like a something around training that you've done a bit of a 180 on that you used to have a different opinion on.
I wouldn't say a 180. Um, I'm sometimes skeptical when people have like extremely drastic changes
Mhm.
of heart.
Yeah.
um, if you've been coaching for like 10 years and then you just completely change your mind and like go from, carnivore to vegan overnight, and like, I don't know if you had like a really strong belief system in place for making that big of a shift, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, and this is not earth shattering by any means, but I think in terms of how I go about like optimizing a concurrent plan of like what are
Mhm.
some of the things that I think are important if you're trying to balance strength and cardio, that kind of stuff. Um, I used to feel more strongly about just some of the like session order. Are you running first or cardio first or lifting first? Like how is your week laid out? I used to just have like stronger opinions about
Mhm.
that. And I think in large part due to just like kind of life stress and chaos of just like sometimes just getting workouts in when I can kind of thing. I've
Yeah.
found that I'm often training in what I would have considered a very suboptimal way of like, oh shoot, just like it works better. I'm gonna go for a run and I'm gonna have a little break and then I'm gonna fit in this lift and like it's not perfect, but I'm just gonna do it. I've had a lot more of that in the last year. Um, and a lot of those sessions went much better than expected.
Right.
um, I've continued to make progress in a lot of things. The other day, I had to run just the way my schedule worked out. I was able to go for a run shortly before an upper body session. And I ended up hitting an incline bench PR after a run. And I was like, well, that's unexpected, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I think my beliefs around a lot of that have just softened and kind of reinforced the belief that like just getting the work done is the most important thing by far.
Yeah.
Lots of things we can optimize, but especially from a concurrent training approach, just get it done. Make sure you're getting some rest somewhere in your schedule. I often don't have a structured rest day or 24 hours off. I often don't do workouts in the perfect order, but I get the work done. I have some leisure time here and there, and I think that's 90% of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I find that sort of change of mind tends to be pretty typical of ways that I've changed my mind on things and other coaches have described as well, and that you kind of it tends to be things you had a strong opinion on, and then they soften, and then ironically, when you think about it, the softening of that strong opinion actually probably ends up aligning more with the kind of true principles of training that we know to be true. So like that goes back to that idea of the thing that underpins everything is being consistent. And even though there might be scientific research out there that could theoretically say maybe putting a run before a lifting session isn't optimal, you train so much and continue to do the important stuff of progressive overload and being consistent and specific in your goals, that, does it really end up making that big of a difference?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like sometimes one of those things that you can know on paper, but then you still have this hesitancy to like put it into practice. 'Cause you almost like nocebo yourself into like, oh, this isn't optimal. It's going to suck.
Hmm.
Um, so it kind of takes some like just getting into it and trying not to think too hard about it sometimes and just like putting some music on, training hard and seeing what happens. And,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the things that we argue about on social media when it comes to, optimizing a training program or an exercise or whatever, we're often arguing about the margins of like 1%, which, if you're watching the Olympics, 1% could certainly be the difference between medaling and not medaling in the 100 meter.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for most people, like 1% is just not that big of a deal.
Yeah. And I think that as more time goes on, we're going to realize more of the rules we think there are around human performance are at best, soft guidelines. I can think of, going back to the CrossFit thing, one thing that really kind of made me start questioning that was I remember that I set a squat PR one time right after doing a pretty challenging leg heavy CrossFit workout. And it just happened the weightlifting coach in the gym was building up to a 1 rep max, and I thought I was going to be doing something stupid, which on paper it would seem like it was. And I wasn't a
Yeah.
beginner. I think it was 170 kilos or something like that I ended up getting. So, enough that some people might have thought there's no way that's going to work. But
There was some, I think it was either last year, it was a couple years ago, maybe in the open. There was some CrossFit workout. There was like a bunch of double unders and a snatch ladder. And I remember like a ton of athletes were like all PRing their snatch in this like ascending ladder with double unders. And they're like, everyone was so confused about it, but like it worked.
there was one year where Rich Froning's final snatch, I think, on the ladder would have put him on the podium for nationals that year.
Wow. That's
Um,
awesome.
that's with like much shorter rest periods in a fatigued state, just totally counterintuitive to what, the mainstream kind of common sense in Olympic weightlifting at the time would have said should work. Obviously, he was a freak
Yeah.
athlete, but
Yeah. Crazy though.
um, okay, well, look, I don't want to take up any more of your time, Alec. It's been great having you on. Obviously, if at any point you'd like to come back on, you're always welcome because I think it's been a great chat. Um, if people want to learn more about you, obviously, if they're not following you on Instagram, they should be. Is that the main place they should go to find you?
Yeah. Follow me on Instagram. Just leave me a message or a comment or something like that if you have questions. I'm trying to make along with watching more Netflix and playing more video games, I'm trying to make more time for my weekly Q&A. I had been on a roll with that of like Q&A every single week, been out of it for a little bit, but I'm trying to bring it back. So keep an eye on my stories and to try to bring that Q&A back. Always enjoy doing that. Just been a little short on time lately, but yeah, follow me on Instagram and drop me a question. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Awesome. And I'm assuming the majority of the work you do in terms of coaching is online coaching.
Yeah, I maintain a very small roster of in-person clients, not taking anyone new. I haven't taken a new client in a couple of years in person, but I have online coaching available. I have programs, a couple different subscription programs depending on your goals. So if you're interested in those, got a bio link on my Instagram. You can also send me a message and kind of ask what would be a good fit for you.
Awesome. Great. Well, it's been great chatting with you, man.
Thank you, Kaylee, and thanks for having me on.